Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. Just as in many areas of life, before you can set a goal, you have to know where you currently are to ensure that the goal for where you want to be is realistic and achievable. Well, in the same way, we went through some previous lessons on conducting a process capability analysis. In many ways, that's like figuring out where you currently are now and how capable your current process is. Well, now that we know that, in this lesson we'll talk about how you can use that information to define the performance objectives or goals that you want to set for improving that process. Well, since this information is only as relevant as the process capability analysis in the previous lessons, I strongly recommend that you review those lessons first before diving into this one. But for now, let's begin by discussing how you can define your performance objectives.
Well, for us to define our performance objectives, we should already know at this point what the performance gaps are. That is, the differences between the voice of the customer and the voice of the process. So let's just do a quick illustration of that again based off of everything we looked at previously regarding process capability. So if we have a distribution like this that represents the actual process performance, then we might say that the customer requirements, that is the voice of the customer, the VOC, might be defined here as our lower spec limit and upper spec limit at some point within this distribution. And then the actual performance of the process, though, would be expressed by the extreme limits of where our overall process capability is, from the lowest end to the highest end. And what we want to understand are the gaps between them, the gaps between what the customer requirements are and where the process capability is. That performance gap is what's reflected here between the voice of the customer and the voice of the process. And then what we need to figure out is what are the objectives that will help us to improve this overall performance. We can reduce this gap so that our capability for the process falls at least on or within the scope of the customer requirements. So what's what we want to figure out and how we can possibly change our scope if it changes at all now that we have an understanding of what our process capability is. Well, in order to figure that out, we need to review that analysis and the performance gap with the team, and we need to consider several things. First of all, we want to figure out how severe is the performance gap. Is it a big deal or not? And are the customer requirements, like the voice of the customer, are those realistic? So should we change or reevaluate what the voice of the customer is, what those requirements are? Should we look at that again in consideration now of what the process is capable of? Because maybe those expectations from the customer are unrealistic. Also, what constraints, such as from equipment or people or cost, what are those constraints that may limit the opportunity to improve that gap or to improve the overall voice of the process? Now, based on the team review of that gap, what we want to figure out is, first of all, what is the reasonable objective that we might have for improving the voice of the process? So is it something that can be defined in terms of the DPMO, like we want to reduce our DPMO or reduce our percent effective, or maybe we want to improve our Z-score or improve the overall CPK and PPK so it at least goes above 1 where it reflects like it's more capable. We might use some measurements like that as an objective so that we can have some measurable goal to work toward. And how should the scope be modified to account for trying to meet those different performance objectives? And whatever we conclude from the team, we need to ensure that the team, which would especially include the sponsoring champion, we want them to make sure that they agree with those new performance objectives and agree with any changes that we might have made to the scope based off of what we've identified now as our performance objectives.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
Well, I'd like you to go back to the two continuous metrics we've been looking at before as we've gone through these lessons related to the process capability. And for each of those metrics, try to answer the following questions. First of all, restate the key process capability values for each metric as we previously defined. That is, figure out again what is the DPMO, what's the Z-score, what's the cumulative probability or the percent effective, and what are the CPK and the PPK. Based off of that information again, we want to figure out what are the performance gaps between those voices of the process that reflect our process capability and the customer requirements reflected in the voice of the customer. And then ask ourselves, what is a reasonable objective for trying to make an improvement to that performance gap? For example, how do you define that objective in terms of process capability? Would you try to show that in terms of a certain reduction in DPMO or in the percent effective, or maybe as an improvement or increase in the amount of CPK or PPK?
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.